Well, here we are again on another September 11th. The date has only fallen on a Sunday 4 times since that awful day, September the 11th, 2001. And every time I hear conversations of memories related to this date, I notice that people will begin to talk immediately about where they were and what they were doing on September the 11th, 2001, which was a Tuesday and a beautiful day. And I actually happened to be at an ABCORI meeting at the First Baptist Church of East Greenwich, and I remember the meeting being interrupted and we heard the news. My son Evan John was about 7 years old then. My son Peter was going on 6. And like all of you, we turned on the TV and we heard this dramatic news of what had happened. And today we remember the nearly 3,000 people who died in the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York City, as well as the 2 planes that crashed, one into the Pentagon and one in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And we know that the terrorists who planned this just catastrophic event, the worst terrorist situation in the history of the world, literally, they did it out of a kind of fanatical religious faith, what we would call toxic religion. So every year when I come to September 11th, and when I see ongoing stories of terrorism that is based on religious fanaticism, I always ask myself the question, how can we do the opposite of that? In opposition to toxic faith, what is healthy religion? How can we practice our faith in a way that brings life and hope and goodness into the world? It's been said that religion is like rain. When it's healthy, it causes everything to grow. Isn't that true with the rain? When it's pure and clean, it comes down onto the land. You can drink it, you can bathe in it, you can be refreshed by it, and it brings fertility to the earth. But what happens when the rain is polluted? What happens when it's diseased and toxic? It destroys everything that it rains on. So it is with religion. And honestly, isn't it true in all of our lives? This is one of the most difficult parts of life to figure out. What does it mean to have authentic Christian faith? In a world where there are so many different options out there. Let's think about that this morning as a way, perhaps even of honoring those who died on September 11th and those who acted in such heroic ways. What a wonderful way to remember them if we could do good in the world on the basis of our faith instead of the evil that was done by the terrorists. And I think this passage from Luke chapter 4 is about that. This is like Jesus' vision of what good religion looks like as opposed to bad religion. He's been preaching and teaching around the towns of Galilee, and his fame is spreading everywhere. And he had his base of operations in a small fishing village called Capernaum. They'd seen him perform miracles there, give sight to the blind, cause the lame to walk, and to speak with a wisdom that they'd never heard before. And now he comes home to Nazareth, his own hometown. And it's a Sabbath day. And so he takes the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and he reads from the scroll. And this is all about what good religion is. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to give sight to the blind, and release to the captives, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. When ultimately, when that day of the Lord comes, these values will be proclaimed in all the earth. God's kingdom will be present among us. And that's exactly what Jesus said. These words are fulfilled now in your presence. So what are those words about? Well, the terrorists on 9/11, what were they about? They were all about destruction. These words about good news for the poor, sight for the blind, the release of the captives, they are about healing. They're about wholeness and wellness for all people. And that's what Jesus came to proclaim. And whenever we follow these values, we truly are practicing good religion after his example. And we have to believe, don't we, that we see the struggle going on all over the world. We see it in our country. We see it in our communities. The conflict between people who are being led astray by the powers of darkness and those who hear this word of light. How can it be stronger? How can it be more powerful than all of the darkness? Well, I'm always looking for examples of that, and sometimes I find powerful ones. One of them actually relates to this church, but I didn't even know that. It was 1994, and we were invited as part of the American Baptist Churches of Rhode Island to participate in building a hospital down in La Romana in the Dominican Republic. And in 1994, Dr. Elihu Wing of our congregation gathered a group of about 5 of us to go on this mission trip. Why? Because there were people down there who needed the good news, not only for their spirits, but also for their bodies, because the Haitian sugarcane workers in La Romana didn't have a hospital. And there was a very high infant mortality rate, and there were some just horrific stories about how people died because they didn't have proper medical care. And many of the diseases that they were dying of were so easily curable, the bacteria-borne diseases from unsanitary conditions. And I was thinking about this week because those images on September 11th of all of those buildings coming down. What we did in La Romana, we went out there with picks and shovels as that hospital was getting built to lay a foundation to build something that would give life and hope to those people. And you know, there was a woman from this church on that trip. And she was an inspiration to all of us. Her name was Margaret Mackney, is that right? Yes. And her, I don't know if it's her niece or another relative, Peggy Mackney, was a longtime friend of mine. She was also on the trip. Who would have known that years later, I actually, at that point, I did not even know that there was a First Baptist Church of North Kingstown until I met Margaret on that trip. And I still have images in my mind. Margaret must have been, in her 70s or so, back in 1994? And we had the bucket brigade out there. We only had one cement mixer. It was like ready to break down. And we would carry the sand and the gravel with these buckets and pass it along to the cement mixer. And there was Margaret as part of that brigade. She was building something that was bringing something very positive into the life of the world. And I remember the title of this message is Never Forget, Always Dream. Always dream. So in spite of the destruction that we see in the world, always dream of something better. And the pastor of the Haitian church in La Romana, his name was Reverend Jean-Luc Fenard. And there's another tragedy related to this day, because you might remember that shortly after 9/11, another plane crashed in New Jersey. Jean-Luc Fenard was on that plane. But I remember so well going out there in the hot sun with these picks and shovels and this old cement mixer. He came out and he thanked us for being part of their dream. And it's lasted even to today, where the hospital now serves really thousands of people. And another person on that trip was a Russian man by the name of Sergei Miroshnichenko, who emigrated from Latvia. And Dr. and Mrs. Elihu Wing gave them a place to stay in their home on the east side to help them get established, because they had a very large family. And Sergei just inspired all of us. He formed a roofing company where he put a roof on my house, actually. And I had a leak this week, boy, we had most roofs or the sewage systems can't really deal with that much water all at once, and that was the case in my house as well. So I called Sergey, and he came right over, where he sent a man right over. And of course, we're remembering, always we remember La Romana and what we did there. And Bonnie went at least once or maybe more to be part of that, to build something that brings health, healing, wellness into the world. And Sergey, now, we also gave them space to use in our church so that the Russian church could get started, and now their church is collecting lots of food, medical supplies, clothing to send to the Ukrainians, because there's a lot of Ukrainians in their congregation. So these are the things that come to mind for me. Okay, the terrorists have these moments when they create cataclysm and suffering and misery in the world. But all of us are invited, in spite of their destruction, to be involved in God's healing and God's wholeness and health. So that's one thing that's there. Another thing now, though, in Jesus, what is healthy religion like? The people were not exactly welcoming of his message to them. In the beginning, it was fine. He sits down, and they're speaking well of him. But then he starts talking a little bit more about, a prophet is really not that welcome usually in his own hometown, even though he's popular in other places. And why is he not welcome? Well, because he says things like, basically, you folks need to think about broadening your vision of faith. You think that God is only on the side of you who are the chosen people. But he reminded them that in the days of Elijah the prophet, one of the prophets who didn't write anything down but who left quite a legacy, there was a 3.5-year drought and famine in the land, and Elijah was given safe harbor in the home, not of a Jewish woman, but of a Phoenician woman. And she's the one now that Jesus lifts up and says, Elijah could have gone to any of the widows of Israel and stayed with her, but instead, God sent her to someone who is outside of that household of faith. And he doesn't stop there. He says, think about Elijah's protege, Elisha. Well, there was also a lot going on during Elisha's day, and in fact, there was a great war in which one of the commanders of the Syrian army, a man by the name of Naaman, had actually defeated the Jewish people. But what does Jesus say? Well, in those days, there were many people who had leprosy in the land of Israel, but here was the leper Naaman, a Syrian, and he was the one that Elisha was sent to in order to heal him of his leprosy. And everything was fine, even though Jesus is like a prophet who's not accepted in his own town. As long as he would just sit down after reading from Isaiah, things were good. But as soon as he starts challenging the people, look, you really need to expand your thinking about who God loves. It's not just you. God truly does love everyone. And this is our challenge today as well. The terrorists, they were so limited in their thinking that their interpretation of Islam, and it's not only Islamic people who do this, in every religion, there's this tendency to say, we are the in group, and everybody who doesn't agree with us, they're on the outside. There is a very powerful word in the English language or any other language, the word them. Us and them. Jesus seems to be saying, now wait a minute, in God's way of thinking, there is no them. There is no them. It's only us. It's only all of us together trying to do God's work. And this is a real challenge, and it always has been for human beings. I heard about this man who was crossing this very high bridge, And he comes across a guy who's ready to jump off and take his life. And he says to the man, "Oh, please don't do it. Please don't do it. God loves you." And the man says, "Well, I know he does because I'm a Christian." And the other man says, "Oh, wow, well, I'm a Christian too. Maybe we could be friends. Are you Protestant or Catholic?" And the man says, "Well, I'm Protestant." And the other guy says, "Well, don't jump. I'm Protestant too. What denomination?" And the man says, I'm Baptist." And the other guy who encountered him said, "Whoa, what do you know? We can definitely be friends. I'm Baptist too." "Well, what conference of the Baptists are you in?" And the guy said, "Well, I'm in the Great Lakes region conference." And the guy says, "Oh, don't jump. We can be friends. I am too." And then the guy says, "But what year of the Great Lakes Conference?" And the man says, "I'm in the year 1912. And the guy's about to jump says, "Well, I'm in the year 1879. And immediately the man pushes him off the bridge and says, "Die, heretic." You know, it's kind of a humorous way of confronting this human tendency that we have of we read, we try to analyze, and we have various experiences of religion. What is it about us that leads us in the direction of saying, you know, our group is really with God, and if you're not with us, well, you know where you're going to go. I'm not exaggerating, right? Isn't this the way we tend to think? And that's the way those terrorists were thinking. That's toxic religion. The way that Jesus is thinking is, how can we come together? What do we have in common with people whose skin color might be different than ours, whose political affiliation might be different from ours, whose sexual orientation might be different from ours? We could go on, who speak a different language than we do. And hey, we are all challenged in this area to relate to those people, especially the people who think and believe differently than we do, and yet who've hurt us, and who've hurt us. And if it goes on like the toxic way of religion, what do we have to offer the world except more death and destruction? But Jesus is saying, don't do that. Don't go toward division. Go toward bringing people together. And as you do, well, you're not going to be popular. He wasn't popular. As soon as he said that, what do they want to do? They want to throw him off a cliff. But he goes through them and has this ongoing ministry about what? It's about the inclusiveness of God's kingdom. And that's what we're challenged to do as well. And it's wonderful to see examples of people who did this. And I do believe that Queen Elizabeth II is one of them. I mean, can you imagine the role that she was in? And you think you have family problems? I think I have family problems. In that very public role for 70 years to be on the throne. And there's this, this tradition that she would get down on her knees every night. And you can see it in her Christmas addresses. She would say, "Please pray for your queen as your queen prays for you." And she truly did try to open up Britain to more people and to proclaim tolerance and acceptance. And you know what? One of the most powerful memories of Queen Elizabeth II was actually after September 11th, 2001, because on the 12th and on the 13th, this was not done. This was like unheard of, with the changing of the colors at Buckingham Palace. I guess they would always play the British national anthem, but instead on those 2 days, they played the American national anthem. And think of the irony of that. Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem during the War of 1812, where the Americans won over the British. And here she is saying, in spite of our history, our hearts are with you during this time. That's the challenge for all of us. Never forget the destruction that happens and those who gave their lives. But always dream, always keep dreaming of a better world. Let us pray. We are humble before you, O Lord. Help us to be people who hear your word proclaiming good news to the poor and liberty to the captives and the oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of your favor when all things will be brought together and your peace will come on earth as it is in heaven.